That breakfast you have been eating for decades, the one that feels healthy, the one your family eats, the one nobody has ever told you to stop, may be doing something to your heart that a standard cholesterol test will never catch. I am Dr. Ben Lown, and what I am about to show you is not about extreme diets or radical changes. It is about 5 specific morning foods that research now links directly to a process called chronic vascular inflammation, the hidden driver behind the majority of heart attacks and strokes in adults over 50. Not acute inflammation that you feel, silent inflammation. The kind that builds inside your arterial walls for years without a single symptom until the day it is not silent anymore. We are counting down from least to most damaging, and I need you to stay until number 1, because that particular food is sitting in almost every kitchen in the country right now and is marketed aggressively as heart healthy. All references are in the description below. But first, quick question. What does your typical breakfast look like right now? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one and I will reply. Now let us get into this. Before we get to the foods, I want to make sure you understand exactly what we are talking about, because the word inflammation gets used so loosely that most people have stopped taking it seriously. And when it comes to your heart after 50, that is a dangerous mistake. Acute inflammation is the kind you can feel, a swollen ankle, a sore throat, your immune system activating visibly in response to an injury or infection. That kind of inflammation is protective and temporary. Chronic vascular inflammation is something completely different. It is a low-grade, persistent immune activation happening silently inside the walls of your arteries, not in response to injury or infection, but in response to what you are repeatedly eating, day after day, year after year. You cannot feel it. It produces no obvious symptoms in its early stages, but inside your arterial walls, it is doing measurable, progressive damage. Here is the mechanism precisely. Your arterial wall contains a layer of endothelial cells, the same lining we discussed in our circulation video. When these cells are repeatedly exposed to inflammatory dietary compounds, they begin producing adhesion molecules, molecular anchors that cause immune cells and oxidized LDL cholesterol particles to stick to the vessel wall. Once stuck, those particles burrow into the wall and trigger a local immune response. Macrophages arrive to clean up the damage. They become engorged with oxidized cholesterol and transform into what researchers call foam cells. Foam cells accumulate. They form fatty streaks. Fatty streaks harden into plaques. Plaques narrow the vessel. And narrowed vessels, under the additional stress of inflammation-driven blood pressure elevation, eventually rupture or block entirely. That is a heart attack. That is a stroke. And the process feeding it starts at breakfast. After 50, this process accelerates for 3 compounding reasons. First, your endothelial cells repair themselves more slowly, meaning each inflammatory insult causes more lasting damage than it did at 35. Second, your baseline inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, fibrinogen, are already elevated compared to younger adults, meaning you are starting each day with a higher inflammatory burden before breakfast even begins. Third, your liver's capacity to process and clear inflammatory byproducts declines, meaning the cumulative effect of inflammatory foods compounds more aggressively than it did in earlier decades. This is not about one bad meal. This is about what happens when the same inflammatory foods are consumed morning after morning for years inside a body whose defensive systems are progressively less capable of neutralizing the damage. Now, let us talk about exactly which foods are doing this and why. Starting at number 5, and this one will surprise people, because fruit juice has been positioned as a health food for generations. Orange juice with breakfast, apple juice for the children, grapefruit juice for the heart. The marketing has been extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily misleading for adults over 50. Here is what the science actually shows. Commercial fruit juice, even 100% pure, no added sugar varieties, delivers a concentrated fructose load to your liver within minutes of consumption that whole fruit never does. When you eat a whole orange, the fiber in the fruit slows the absorption of its natural sugars dramatically. Fructose enters your bloodstream gradually. Your liver processes it at a manageable rate, and your blood sugar rises modestly. When you drink a glass of orange juice, that fiber is gone. The fructose from 3 to 4 oranges hits your liver simultaneously in liquid form with no buffering mechanism. Your liver responds to this fructose surge through a pathway called de novo lipogenesis. It converts the excess fructose directly into triglycerides. Elevated triglycerides are not merely a cholesterol panel number, they are themselves pro-inflammatory. They activate inflammatory signaling cascades in your endothelial cells. They increase the production of small, dense LDL particles, the most arterially dangerous form of LDL, and they elevate C-reactive protein, one of the most reliable blood markers of active vascular inflammation. A landmark study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found that adults who consumed 1 or more servings of fruit juice daily had significantly higher inflammatory marker profiles and a measurably greater cardiovascular event risk compared to those who consumed whole fruit instead, even when total calorie intake was identical. The difference was not the fruit. It was the fiber removal and the resulting fructose delivery rate. After 50, this effect is amplified because insulin sensitivity declines with age, meaning your cells are less efficient at clearing glucose and fructose from circulation. The liver is burdened longer. The triglyceride response is greater. The inflammatory downstream effect is more pronounced. The same glass of orange juice that your body managed reasonably well at 30 is producing a meaningfully different metabolic response at 55 or 65. What to do instead? Eat the whole fruit. 1 whole orange provides the same vitamins as a glass of juice with a fraction of the inflammatory impact. If you genuinely enjoy a morning drink, cold water with fresh lemon juice preserves vitamin C while delivering negligible fructose and none of the triglyceride-driving surge that commercial juice produces. Moving to number 4, and this is one that genuinely shocks people when they see the data. Because yogurt has been culturally embedded as the definition of a healthy breakfast for decades. And plain, unsweetened yogurt absolutely can be beneficial. The problem is that almost nobody eats plain, unsweetened yogurt for breakfast. They eat flavored yogurt. Strawberry, vanilla, blueberry, peach. And those products are a completely different food from a cardiovascular standpoint. The average flavored yogurt, including most brands marketed specifically as healthy or low-fat, contains between 15 and 26 grams of added sugar per serving. That single serving delivers more added sugar than the American Heart Association recommends for an entire day for adults over 50. But the sugar content alone does not capture the full inflammatory picture. Most flavored yogurts also contain modified food starch, artificial flavors, carrageenan, a seaweed-derived thickener that multiple animal and cell studies have linked to intestinal inflammation, and in low-fat varieties, significantly higher sugar content used to compensate for the lost flavor that fat previously provided. The low-fat label is particularly deceptive. Fat in dairy does not drive vascular inflammation in the way that was assumed for decades. The refined carbohydrates and additives substituted for that fat absolutely do. The mechanism runs through your gut. High-sugar, low-fiber breakfast foods disrupt the balance of your gut microbiome within hours of consumption, specifically reducing populations of the lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species that produce short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, which is the primary fuel source for your intestinal barrier cells. A weakened intestinal barrier allows bacterial endotoxins, specifically lipopolysaccharide, to leak into your bloodstream. Lipopolysaccharide is one of the most potent activators of vascular inflammation known to biology. It directly triggers the endothelial adhesion molecule expression that begins the plaque cascade. Researchers call this process metabolic endotoxemia, and studies show it is measurably elevated in adults who regularly consume high-sugar, low-fiber breakfasts, compared to those who do not. After 50, gut barrier integrity naturally declines, and microbiome diversity decreases. This means the inflammatory response to a high-sugar breakfast is both more pronounced and more prolonged than it was in younger decades. What to do instead? Plain, full-fat Greek yogurt with no added flavoring, topped with a small handful of fresh berries and a tablespoon of ground flaxseed. The protein and fat in plain Greek yogurt slow gastric emptying, support stable blood sugar, and provide the probiotic benefit the marketing promises without the inflammatory sugar load that undermines it. At number 3, and I want to be precise here because the category of breakfast cereal is broad, and the most dangerous products within it are not the obviously sugary children's cereals that most adults over 50 have already moved away from. The most inflammatory cereals for the post-50 cardiovascular system are the ones positioned most aggressively as healthy: whole grain cereals, bran cereals, and especially granola. Here is what makes granola particularly problematic. It is almost universally perceived as a natural, wholesome food. Oats, nuts, seeds, dried fruit. And in its homemade form, with controlled ingredients, it can be. But commercial granola, including most premium and organic varieties, is bound together and sweetened with substantial quantities of honey, maple syrup, agave, cane sugar, or brown rice syrup. A standard half-cup serving of commercial granola, which is far smaller than most people actually pour, typically contains between 12 and 22 grams of sugar and between 7 and 14 grams of fat, a significant portion of which comes from refined seed oils used in the roasting process. Those refined seed oils, sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil used at high roasting temperatures, are the specific inflammatory driver that makes commercial granola a cardiovascular concern beyond its sugar content. These oils are rich in omega-6 linoleic acid. In moderate amounts, and in their unprocessed forms, omega-6 fatty acids are not inherently harmful. But when heated to the high temperatures used in commercial granola production, they undergo oxidation. They become oxidized lipids. And oxidized lipids in your bloodstream are among the most directly arterially damaging compounds your endothelium encounters. They integrate into LDL particles, making those particles far more likely to penetrate arterial walls and initiate the foam cell cascade. They directly damage endothelial cell membranes, and they are nearly invisible on standard dietary labels because they are simply listed as oil content, with no indication of their oxidation state. A study from the University of Minnesota measured oxidized lipid biomarkers in adults consuming typical commercial granola breakfasts versus whole food breakfasts, and found significantly elevated F2 isoprostane levels, a reliable blood marker of lipid oxidation and vascular oxidative stress, in the granola group within 4 hours of consumption. After 50, your body's antioxidant defense systems, particularly superoxide dismutase and glutathione peroxidase, are less robust than they were in earlier decades, meaning your capacity to neutralize oxidized lipids after consumption is reduced. The vascular damage from each serving accumulates more efficiently. What to do instead? Plain rolled oats cooked in water with a small handful of raw, unsalted walnuts, a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, and fresh berries. This delivers the fiber and satiety of a grain-based breakfast without the oxidized lipids, without the sugar surge, and with the addition of walnut-derived alpha-linolenic acid, which actively counters the inflammatory pathways granola triggers. If this information is valuable to you, take 2 seconds right now and hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps this video reach other people over 50 who genuinely need this information. And if you want to know the 5 foods that actively protect your heart in the morning, the anti-inflammatory breakfast upgrades that replace everything I am describing today, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because that is exactly what my next video covers. Now let us get to the 2 most damaging foods on this list. Number 2. And this is the food that I find most troubling to discuss, because it was actively recommended by mainstream medicine for decades as a heart-healthy alternative to butter, and that recommendation caused measurable cardiovascular harm to an entire generation of adults who trusted it. Margarine and vegetable oil spreads were created through a process called partial hydrogenation, forcing hydrogen atoms into liquid vegetable oils under high pressure and temperature to make them solid at room temperature. This process creates trans fatty acids, a class of fat that does not exist in meaningful quantities in nature and that the human body has no evolved metabolic pathway to handle safely. The cardiovascular effects of dietary trans fats are now so thoroughly documented that they are no longer scientifically controversial. Trans fatty acids simultaneously raise LDL cholesterol, lower HDL cholesterol, increase lipoprotein A, an independent cardiovascular risk marker, elevate C-reactive protein, impair endothelial function directly, and increase systemic inflammatory cytokines, including tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6. A comprehensive Harvard School of Public Health analysis estimated that eliminating trans fats from the American diet would prevent between 72,000 and 228,000 cardiac events annually. That is the scale of the damage a single category of breakfast spread was causing. Now here is the critical point for adults over 50 specifically. In many countries, regulatory pressure has forced manufacturers to reformulate products to eliminate or reduce trans fats from hydrogenation. And many products now legitimately contain 0 or near 0 partially hydrogenated oils. However, and this is where the danger persists, reformulated margarine and vegetable spreads typically replaced hydrogenated fats with high oleic sunflower oil, palm oil, or interesterified fats. Interesterified fats are produced through a different chemical process that avoids trans fat formation, but that emerging research now links to elevated fasting blood glucose, increased LDL particle number, and pro-inflammatory changes in lipid metabolism. A study published in Nutrition and Metabolism found that a diet containing interesterified fat produced significantly worse inflammatory and metabolic markers than a diet containing natural saturated fat from butter or dairy. The pattern here is consistent across decades of reformulation history. A natural fat is demonized. An industrial substitute is created and marketed as healthier. The industrial substitute eventually proves more harmful. After 50, when your cardiovascular system has less reserve capacity to absorb repeated inflammatory insults, the cumulative effect of decades of industrial fat consumption is not trivial. What to do instead? Real butter from grass-fed cows in moderate quantities, or better, half a ripe avocado spread directly on whole grain toast. Avocado provides monounsaturated oleic acid, potassium, magnesium, and plant sterols, all of which actively support endothelial health rather than undermining it. The inflammatory contrast between a margarine-spread toast and an avocado toast at the biochemical level is not subtle. It is substantial. And here is number 1. The most chronically inflammatory morning food for adults over 50 that the research supports, and the one that is most consistently underestimated because it has been normalized so thoroughly as simply part of a standard breakfast that its cardiovascular cost has become culturally invisible. Processed breakfast meats: bacon, breakfast sausage, ham, Canadian bacon, turkey sausage, sausage patties, products that appear on breakfast tables across the world every single morning and that carry a specific cluster of inflammatory compounds that act on your cardiovascular system through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. The first mechanism is nitrite-derived nitrosamine formation. Sodium nitrite is used as a preservative and color stabilizer in virtually all commercially processed meats. When consumed, nitrites interact with amines naturally present in meat protein during digestion to form nitrosamines, compounds that are directly genotoxic and that have been shown to damage arterial endothelial cells, impair mitochondrial function in cardiac muscle cells, and activate inflammatory NF-kappa-B signaling in vascular tissue. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen, the same category as tobacco, based on consistent evidence across 800 studies. The vascular inflammatory effects are a parallel consequence of the same underlying chemical mechanisms. The second mechanism is advanced glycation end products, AGEs. Processed meats cooked at high temperatures, bacon fried in a pan, sausage browned on a griddle, generate extraordinarily high concentrations of AGEs through the Maillard reaction. AGEs bind to specific receptors on endothelial cells called RAGE receptors, receptor for advanced glycation end products, and their activation produces a cascade of inflammatory cytokines, increases oxidative stress in the vessel wall, reduces nitric oxide availability, and accelerates arterial stiffening. Research from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai found that dietary AGE intake was independently predictive of arterial stiffness progression in adults over 50 after controlling for every other dietary and lifestyle variable measured. The third mechanism is sodium-driven endothelial dysfunction. A single serving of commercial bacon or breakfast sausage typically contains between 400 and 800 milligrams of sodium. After 50, sodium sensitivity increases as kidney function gradually declines and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system becomes less dynamically responsive. High sodium intake in this context produces acute endothelial dysfunction, a measurable reduction in flow-mediated dilation lasting 3 to 4 hours after consumption, through mechanisms involving oxidative stress and reduced nitric oxide bioavailability. This means that every morning serving of processed breakfast meat is producing a several-hour window of impaired vascular function that accumulates in damage over years of daily exposure. The fourth, and perhaps most insidious mechanism, is heme iron overload. Red and processed meats are the primary dietary source of heme iron, the highly bioavailable form of iron found in animal tissue. Unlike non-heme iron from plant sources, heme iron is absorbed regardless of your body's current iron status, and without the regulatory mechanisms that prevent overaccumulation. After 50, and particularly in postmenopausal women and older men who no longer lose iron through menstruation or growth demands, excess iron accumulates in tissues, including arterial walls, where it acts as a potent catalyst for lipid oxidation, the exact process that converts harmless LDL cholesterol into the oxidized LDL that penetrates arterial walls and initiates plaque formation. Multiple large prospective studies have found that high heme iron intake in adults over 50 is independently associated with significantly elevated cardiovascular disease risk after controlling for saturated fat, sodium, and total calorie intake.
4 simultaneous mechanisms.
Nitrosamine-driven endothelial damage, AGE receptor inflammatory activation, sodium-induced vascular dysfunction, heme iron-catalyzed lipid oxidation. All 4 triggered by a single breakfast serving of bacon or sausage. All 4 compounding in a body where the repair systems are slower, the baseline inflammation is higher, and the arterial reserve is thinner than it was 2 decades ago. A large-scale prospective cohort study published in the European Heart Journal followed over 29,000 adults for an average of 18 years and found that each additional daily serving of processed meat was associated with an 18% increase in cardiovascular mortality, an association that strengthened progressively with age and was strongest in the 50 to 70 age bracket specifically. What to do instead? And I want to be practical here because I understand that breakfast habits are deeply ingrained. 2 whole eggs from pasture-raised hens, cooked in a small amount of butter or extra virgin olive oil, with a side of sliced avocado and a handful of fresh spinach or arugula. This combination delivers complete protein, anti-inflammatory monounsaturated and omega-3 fats, folate, lutein, and natural nitrates from the leafy greens that your body converts to vascular protective nitric oxide, the precise opposite of what processed meat delivers. It is satisfying, it takes 5 minutes to prepare, and it replaces every harmful mechanism of a processed meat breakfast with an actively cardioprotective one. Let me bring this together clearly. Chronic vascular inflammation after 50 is not a vague concept. It is a specific, measurable biological process driven by repeated dietary exposures that most people are completely unaware of, because the foods driving it have been normalized, marketed as healthy, and woven into daily breakfast routines for generations. Commercial fruit juice triggers fructose-driven triglyceride production and endothelial inflammation. Flavored yogurt disrupts gut barrier integrity and drives metabolic endotoxemia. Commercial granola and breakfast cereals deliver oxidized lipids that directly damage arterial walls. Margarine and vegetable spreads provide industrial fats your body cannot safely metabolize, and processed breakfast meats attack your vascular system through 4 simultaneous mechanisms that compound with every morning serving. The good news, and I want to end on this clearly, is that chronic vascular inflammation responds to dietary change faster than almost any other cardiovascular risk factor. Studies measuring inflammatory biomarkers after dietary intervention consistently show meaningful reductions in C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and oxidized LDL within 2 to 4 weeks of removing the primary inflammatory drivers. Your endothelium regenerates. Your arterial walls begin remodeling. The process that has been quietly building damage begins to slow and, in many cases, partially reverse. You do not need a prescription for that.
You need a different breakfast. I am Dr. Ben Lown. If this video gave you something genuinely useful today, please subscribe and ring the notification bell, because my next video covers the 5 specific morning foods that clinical research shows actively reduce vascular inflammation after 50, the direct anti-inflammatory replacements for everything I described today. You are going to want to see that one. And before you go, drop one thing in the comments. Which of these 5 surprised you most? Tell me below. I read every single comment and I will personally reply. Take good care of your heart. I will see you in the next one.